there are a few programs in this country of restorative justice diversion that are actually integrated into the justice system. And they involve victim-offender dialogue. And this requires, typically in these systems, requires quite a lot. So it requires voluntary cooperation on the part of both the victim and the offender, who agree that they would like to have this diversion from the usual system. And then the case moves out of the adversarial legal system into this other track. The offender, the victim, the facilitator, law enforcement all come together and they engage in a kind of a conference. And each person speaks about the crime and its effects and their experiences. And the idea is that the group then, after listening to each, comes to a consensus about how to repair the harm. Now, typically this system addresses crimes ranging from simple assault to harassment, to theft, to property crimes. And the question is, where is it appropriate to employ something like this system? And in particular, should we be employing it everywhere, right? Should we be employing it in the case of the most violent crimes? And why or why not? So I want to kind of plant that question, and we will be able to come back to it and reflect together on it. But this is it's a calling on you to reflect on your own sense of what the place of restorative justice might be. And of course, that's a contextual question, and I'm assuming in our context, right? Where do you think that system has a place? So just with that question kind of planted, I want to turn to some of the key biblical texts for thinking about prisons. How do Christians think about prisons in relationship to Scripture? And one of these key texts comes from the Gospel of Luke, comes from the inauguration of Jesus' ministry. So an important moment, right, in the narrative. Jesus comes to Nazareth. He goes to the synagogue. He is given the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and begins reading. And it's, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, right? There's other things going on here, but this is the proclamation of the year of the Lord's favor, and a key element of the proclamation of the year of the Lord's favor is release to the captives. And he rolls up the scroll and he sits down and he says, today this scripture has been proclaimed in your hearing. So there's lots of questions here. Who are these captives? Why are they to be released? That's one question. And that's, of course, complicated by the fact that Jesus is reading from the prophet Isaiah, and clearly trying to speak to his own moment. But this is also something that has its meaning within the context of Isaiah. Captivity in that context in ancient Israel is not the same as captivity in the time of Jesus, right? So the original context is probably a reference to the Babylonian captivity. So the release of the captives is the release from this captivity of the people of Israel. But in the Roman Empire, so in Jesus' context, imprisonment there, typically in the ancient world, imprisonment is not itself conceived of as a form of punishment. Imprisonment is generally one of two things. It's pretrial detention, so before you can be tried, and then the penalty would be, whatever exile, having your hand chopped off, various forms of penalties in the ancient world, but not typically imprisonment. It could be a fine. Sometimes this was abused if there were political reasons to not want this person wandering around. So sometimes pretrial detention was kind of dragged out into effectively a more extended imprisonment. So, is Jesus talking about political imprisonment here? Most likely he's talking about debtors' prisons. Right? So this is where we see imprisonment in the Roman Empire. Captivity of debtors comes up multiple times in the Gospels. So clearly there is a special preoccupation here. There was chronic indebtedness among the poor. So I think that's really important context for how we think about this passage. Well, what about the year of the Lord's favor that's being proclaimed here? Within Isaiah, and within Jesus, this is a reference to the Jubilee year, right? The 50th year, the year when debts are to be canceled, indentured servants freed, land returned, and so on. So invoking the year of the Lord's favor is a hint that we're probably talking about debtors' prisons here when it comes to Jesus. And liberty to captives, to proclaim liberty to the captives, is very much bound up with notions of canceling debt and restoring something like social equality. Let's hit reset. Inequalities have built up. Let's move back to something closer to social equality. But still, we're left with the question of what does it mean to say that Isaiah's prophecy has been fulfilled today in your hearing? What does it mean to Jesus hearers? What does it mean to readers of these scriptures today? When you read it and the prophecy has been fulfilled, when there are plenty of people who are captives, right? The captives have not been set free. Does it mean that Jesus' proclamation of the Jubilee makes it so, right? That brings about the Jubilee? Does it mean something more complicated than that? We just don't see it. So let me just pause for a second and invite, what are the obvious interpretations of today this prophecy has been fulfilled in your hearing? There's multiple responses here. So what are some of them? So, one way we might think about this is in relationship to keeps coming back again, right? Realism, integrity, synergy, and liberation. And to think about, well, how might each of these be related to interpreting this scripture is fulfilled today? So we might expect that realism would say, don't expect significant social change. This is maybe a spiritual teaching. Maybe it's just about living in hope for the second coming of Jesus. So the kingdom may be proclaimed, inaugurated, the reign of God, but it's a spiritual reality or it's a hidden reality. Integrity might insist that the life of the church must anticipate the eschatological kingdom. So all of these things are being realized, but where are they? What's the space within which they're being realized? That space is the space of the life of the church, not the space of the broader society. Synergy, well, maybe this is really asking us to engage in gradual reforms of society in the direction that's being articulated here. And that we can be hopeful that, say, Christians and non-Christians will be in sync on this, that there will be a sense in which there's a common ideal that we can move towards. And liberation, insisting that Christians ought to be using their agency not just to transform the life of the church, but to be transforming the life of the world in this way. So more revolutionary orientation. So what's your hunch? Where would the prison abolition movement be located in relationship to these possibilities? Liberation?
Or maybe synergy, but probably for abolition would be liberation.
Probably liberation. Yeah, now I think what's interesting is, and I think that's absolutely right, but one of our readings today I think we might want to see as in the integrity strand, and so try to think about ways in which both of those could be inspiring the prison abolition movement. All right, so another key text for thinking about prisons in the Christian tradition is Matthew 25. This eschatological text, when the Son of Man returns in his glory, and we've got the sheep and the goats gathered, and the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." So we get this string of things that people have done unknowingly to the least of these, and in so doing, they have done them to the Son of Man. Right? And one of them is to visit those in prison. Yeah, this is not visiting them in prison and setting the doors ajar, right, so that people can escape. It's this simple act of visiting those in prison. And this text gives rise to, did I get ahead of myself here? No, I didn't. This text gives rise to the notion of the corporal works of mercy, right? So feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, shelter the homeless, visit the sick, visit the prisoners. And this is really important in medieval piety. We get many depictions of the works of mercy, especially starting in the 12th century. And what is their significance? They're seen as important ways in which Christians are to ease suffering in the world, right? So they are directed toward suffering. They are also seen as pleasing God. This is what God wants Christians to be doing. And it's seen as a path to meriting eternal life. These are works, right? They're works that earn merit. And we might say, if you put this passage from Matthew next to the passage from Luke, you might feel as though, well, Christians get more specific guidance here, right? There's not just this sort of ideal image, but one gets specific actions that need to be performed, rules, not just the focal image, right, or the symbolic world of the kingdom. Of course, it actually is much more complicated than that, because this is still nested. It's nested in a story, right, about the Son of Man, and it's not actually direct instruction to the reader, but it tends to be received more as direct instruction to the reader. And what are the assumptions here? There seems to be an assumption that there will always be those who are hungry, those who are thirsty, in need of clothing, sick and in prison, so that they can be tended to, right? So they can be visited. The poor you will always have with you, right, in another context. And indeed, if the poor are blessed, then maybe there's not a strong mandate to abolish poverty. And maybe if Christians are to visit those in prison, maybe there's not a strong mandate to release the prisoners. So we can see that there's some tensions here, potential tensions here, and this passage gives rise to a strand of the tradition that is much less transformationist. And we might think about how involved Christians have been over the centuries in prison ministry, just uninterrupted, various forms, obviously, in different social contexts, of this notion that, no, literally, we were told we were supposed to visit the prisoners, and so that's the fundamental thing that needs to be done, is to visit the prisoners and to minister to them. So as the readings make clear, in addition to this long-standing Christian involvement in prison ministry, there has been quite a long-standing tradition of Christian reflection on prison abolition. And the reading that we had from Vincent Lloyd and Josh Dubler, from this book, Break Every Yoke, this is a 2019 book, they trace this movement over 4 decades. So one gets a sense, okay, this is something that has been a priority for certain Christians for a significant period of time. Now, right now, I think it's getting a lot more attention. The prison abolition movement, not just within Christian groups, but the prison abolition movement more generally, is getting a lot of attention. But part of their point is it's not new. And if it's not new, then one question that kind of hovers is, why hasn't it had more impact What is keeping it from making a transformative difference? And I think that's one of the key questions that they are asking as they engage in this. And they develop, what I'll call the sort of Dubler-Lloyd thesis here. And the thesis is that the abolitionist spirit, that's what one of their phrases, right? The abolitionist spirit has to remain grounded in practices of grassroots organizing. And part of the problem is that they trace what they see over this period of time as a movement away from grassroots organizing. So certainly they say there's a long history of denominational statements calling for reform, calling for restorative justice, but this has had little impact. And they trace the history of religious, Christian, Jewish, and indigenous involvement in criminal justice reform in various ways. But, instead of gaining momentum, they think that these efforts at reform have accomplished very little, even when they've been quite radical. So they seem to be making a number of different arguments. So they want to acknowledge that there has been much criticism of prisons, not just among progressives, but also among more conservative Christians with different emphases, but still a lot of criticism of the prison. And reformist approaches are common, and they think have been not just ineffectual, but have really backfired. So this is, I think, a passage that's worth actually reading, right? Calls for more humane prisons became grounds for building new prisons. Criticism of sentencing disparities lengthened sentences across the board. Opposition to the death penalty led to the expansion of life without parole, and voluntaristic enthusiasm for ministering to incarcerated men and women, prison ministry, became yet another stanchion of neoliberal prison administration. So it's kind of a disheartening litany here, because as again and again, they're driving home that efforts at reform have backfired in all of these various ways. The caretakers, the profiteers of the dominant carceral order have had no trouble deflecting and absorbing the criticisms in ways that really just entrench the system. So what do they think is needed? What's needed is the abolition spirit. The abolition spirit that's going to bubble up from the grassroots. It's not primarily going to be found in institutions or elites, and it is quenched by bureaucracy. And so the call is for grassroots mobilization. And they think that, so they call it the spirit of abolition. The other partner here is that they think that not only does it need to be grassroots as opposed to institutional, it needs to be religious. So part of what they think they see as they trace this through 4 decades is a loss of religious language as religious movements seek to work with or appeal to secular partners. So we're told that old religious institutions need to be revitalized, new forms of collectivity need to be fostered, and this is the way that once dormant theologies will be given new life. Now, we might wonder whether this call in the end for religious mobilization might end up actually feeding back into what they see as the problem, because it seems to be a call for a kind of institutional power. Note that they say here, old religious institutions need to be revitalized, and new forms of collectivity need to be fostered, and only by gathering institutional power. Well, how do you gather institutional power without involving these institutions, right? Or without transforming the grassroots, bubbling up the spirit, the abolitionist spirit, into something that's institutional? I don't know that they have an answer. I think they're wrestling with this question. So what is the solution here? There's certainly a vision of restorative justice. There's a vision of it coming out of the grassroots. There's a vision of it being a kind of spirit. It needs a spirituality, whether it's Christian or Jewish or indigenous. It needs to have spirituality behind it. But there's not a roadmap here, right, for how to implement this on a massive scale. Well, Lee Griffith, I guess I'm ahead of myself here, sorry. Lee Griffith in Fall of the Prison, our other reading for today, makes some of the same points about how various religious efforts at reform have backfired. And I would underscore that. So while the Lloyd Dubler book is from 2019, The Fall of the Prison, this book by Lee Griffith, is from 1993. So already in 1993, he was saying, oh, there have been all these reform efforts, and they haven't really had a transformative effect. He writes, the history of Christendom is a history of chaplains who help to oppress prisoners and of reforms that help to entrench the prison system. So a keen sense that this Christian tradition of prison ministry has not been transformative. Now, one major difference between what we get in Lee Griffith's analysis and what we get in Lloyd Dubler's analysis is that we don't get race as a central lens of analysis in Lee Griffith's book. So I think it's an important question, why not? And here we might note that Michelle Alexander, who's the author of this enormously important book, The New Jim Crow, a 2010 book, she shares that in the late 1990s, she would have argued strenuously against the argument of her own book. So, we have to think, well, in 1993, how were people thinking about these issues? So she noted rising incarceration rates in poorer communities of color. She wasn't blind to that development, but she, at that point, saw it to be a function of poverty, function of lack of access to quality education. Now what she sees is a new racial caste system. It's a new racial caste system. It operates to exclude an extraordinary percentage of black men from voting, legally subjects them to discrimination in employment and housing and education and public benefits and more. How does it legally discriminate against them in these ways? Because they're imprisoned or because they carry a felony conviction. So, in part through Michelle Alexander's grasping of this, and in part through her book, and also more generally, an awakening on this score, there is, of course, today, we're confronting the racialization of this system. But how did this come to be? Well, just briefly. Came to be through the war on drugs, I think, most centrally. So the war on drugs was declared by Nixon in 1971. And at that time, the prison population was low, and it was declining, and the US looked like Western Europe in terms of prison population. The mainstream academic view at this time was that prisons would fade away. So at that point, it seemed like all these reform efforts are having an impact. They are leading to a transformation of the system. So was the war on drugs a response to recreational drug use, a rise in drugs? Well, there's this very revealing interview in 1994 with Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, that makes very clear that the war on drugs was not a response to anything that was going on with drugs at the time. It was a very intentional political strategy. So Ehrlichman was quoted as saying, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black," so I think context of the Vietnam War, "but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." So this was the tactic. So that was the original war on drugs, Nixon's war on drugs in 1971. In 1982, the war on drugs is redeclared. What's the context for that? It's redeclared before crack begins to spread in poor black communities. And the emergence of crack was publicized in order to build political support for the war on drugs. And then what do we see? We see higher rates of imprisonment for drug offenses. We see longer sentences for drug offenses, and we see minimum sentencing requirements that require these long sentences for drug offenses. And there's a massive set of social consequences to these policies, a real explosion of prison populations, the building of prisons, the privatizing of prisons, and the emergence of what we today call the prison industrial complex, where more and more people's livelihoods flow directly from the existence of these prisons. More and more small towns in America where the population is heavily dependent economically on the existence of these prisons. And the US has the highest incarceration rates in the world. If you're interested in getting more data on this, you can get it from the Sentencing Project, sentencingproject.org, but many of this may be familiar to you by now, that African Americans are imprisoned at 5 times the rate of whites, and in at least 5 states at rates that are over 10 times those of whites. And in general, BIPOC Americans are arrested at higher rates and imprisoned at higher rates. So, how should Christian responses change given the knowledge of the deliberate racism that was behind this initial war on drugs, and given the knowledge of ongoing racial disparities in this system? Does this reframe the narrative of the futility and ineffectiveness of the reform efforts? It's another way to read it, that the reform efforts were successful, can be successful, but they have to reckon with this kind of intentional political manipulation. So perhaps there's less reason for despair over lack of impact, because the efforts weren't just facing the status quo, but they were facing this new thing, the war on drugs. But it's also sobering to realize how easily fear is mobilized, right, to create massive structures that are so difficult to undo. So Griffith offers a different vision, I think, than that of Dubler and Lloyd. There are ways that they can talk to one another, obviously, but there's less a call for mass mobilization here or for institutional change. There's more a call for living a radical alternative. So this is, I think, an integrity strand, not a liberationist strand primarily. So Griffith, in reckoning with this question, how does proclaiming the fall of the prison make a difference, right? How does it change anything to read that gospel? How can one live differently once one has proclaimed the fall of the prison, given that the prisons remain there and the whole prison industrial complex is still there? Well, so his answer to that is to point to witnessing to the presence of God's kingdom. Right? When we witness to the presence of God's kingdom, that demythologizes us, he says. That transforms our understanding of the reality in which we're living. So we find here a call to discipleship that's centered on Jesus' call to set the prisoners free, and an insistence that if we deny the reality of Jesus' proclamation of freedom for the prisoners, then we deny God's freedom for everyone, including ourselves. This is a fundamental teaching. This is not just sort of a marginal thing. Many Christians might say, well, this is the vast landscape of things that Christians should be concerned with, and this is sort of over here, not in the center. And Griffith sees it very, very differently. If Jesus is here to give freedom to all, then we have to start with freedom for the prisoners and living that out. On this analysis, Christianity is bound up with the powers that be. Christianity has been warped since Christendom was inaugurated. It's been warped since the conversion of Constantine, since it became bound up with making sure that society keeps humming along, being responsible, keeping law and order. And that's just not what a proclamation of freedom is all about. So at the outset, I was suggesting that we need to see Jesus' proclamation of freedom for the captives in his own context as being about debt, right? He's concerned about debtors' prisons. It's the grinding poverty in this Roman Empire, in this far corner of the Roman Empire, that is his primary concern. Well, Griffith says, look, I'm not changing the subject from that. We're not missing the point when today we say responding to prisons in our context is a concern for debt, right? A concern for economic inequality. Because much crime issues out of that very economic inequality. You have to not just look at the individual crime and why was this committed. You have to look at the whole economic structure that is setting up a system in which people identify success with the acquisition of money, with the acquisition of things that money can buy, and a culture that restricts people's access to legal means for acquiring success. So here we could draw a strong connection between what's going on in Griffith's analysis and what Daniel Bell was arguing in The Economy of Desire, that too much importance is loaded onto the material when it's seen as the root of happiness. Thieves, Griffith says, are not rebelling against American materialism. They're affirming it. So what's at stake here is the whole American dream, right, which is bound up with material success, the pursuit of happiness, setting a context in which crime may seem the only path. All right, so as I've said, he doesn't offer a significant racial lens of analysis, which we can understand given his context in 1993, but he does recognize that many crimes are not sins, and many sins are not crimes. Now, what does that mean? That means that societies decide what to make a crime. Right? There's all kinds of harms that are done, and all kinds of injustices that are done that are not crimes. We decide what is going to be a crime, and that's not a neutral determination. So this war on drugs that was first declared in 1971, restarted in 1983, it has quite a life, doesn't it? In the 1990s, it was still the dominant lens for public discussion of crime. And Griffith underscores that we all are stuck in this system. Right? The policy and the prison guards are victimized by the same system that victimizes prisoners. The police do not carry guns because they are brutal people. They carry guns because the power of the gun is the only power of which the fallen state avails itself. They become more and more entrenched in this reliance on weapons. So he does make some policy proposals, even though his primary emphasis is on living this witness. There are things that we could do. We could decriminalize drug offenses. Right? Okay, we've made some movement on that front, right? We could give more probation sentences, more sentences to community service. But centrally, his policy proposal is to move toward restorative justice, right? To move toward victim-offender reconciliation. That's not focused on punishment, but it's focused on the need of victims, the needs of victims, which are for healing. Healing is needed by both offender and victim. So let's pause here for a bit to come back to that question that I kind of planted, or that couple of questions that I planted at the beginning of class as we think about victim-offender reconciliation, as we think about restorative justice, diversion. How much hope does this hold out? Where would you find it appropriate to be implemented? Is this where we should be investing our energies to transform this system that we've gotten ourselves into? As I said, it's a system that's used primarily for minor crimes, nonviolent crimes. Would you want to see us support it everywhere for use in all crimes? Right. So to abstract the relationship between victim and offender from the whole structure of society and the ideals of the society is kind of a false abstraction. And the transformation that needs to take place is so wholesale, right? Yeah. Well, I think that is part of the reason that although we do find Griffith making some policy proposals, right, suggesting decriminalization of some offenses, proposing shifting to victim-offender reconciliation when possible and so on, that's really not his primary message, right? The primary focus is on a call to discipleship and a radical call to discipleship. Christians, he thinks, should be paying bail for criminals, should be involved in not just in reconciliation initiatives, but in, as he puts it, voluntarily assuming care and responsibility for those who could pose a threat. Right? And we get various anecdotes, and I want to underscore they're anecdotes. And part of what I think we want to wrestle with is, what do you do with anecdotes? But I think in part, his answer to that is, anecdotes are witness. Right? They are individual experiences, but they call us to reflect. They may call us to transform our lives also in response to them. So, so what are these stories? They're stories about how sometimes it's possible to transform potentially violent encounters through making a human connection with somebody who might be about to assault you, through offering engagement. But be realistic enough to identify that as a dangerous thing to do, right? It might be something you might lose your life in being involved in this. So it's not a guaranteed tactic. It's not like, here's the rule book for how you can engage in potentially dangerous situations transformatively and come out with peace and friendship. But I think he is realistic enough to say it's not a tactic. There's a genuine vulnerability here, but it's a form of vulnerability that he thinks some of us at least are called to live out. He notes his association with the Catholic peace activist Phil Berrigan. He notes his association with the Catholic worker house movement. So I commented earlier on this tradition of the works of mercy seeming very much to be non-transformative, right? The works of mercy is just, okay, the system is there, people will be poor, people will be in prison, and all you do is you go and you visit them and so on. But here is a way of understanding the works of mercy as radical discipleship, right? Not a Band-Aid, self-involving, putting yourself on the line. So in our final minute or two here, I invite your responses to, his anecdotes or your responses to this notion of radical discipleship that is so risking of oneself as to engage, go into danger, walk into the dangerous situation, or invite it into your house.